previous government. So even if they didn't do it, and they acknowledge the Sierra Leone women in particular about the kinds of things that they went through. So it's your call. Whether you think it's useful, whether you think an important signal to Tunisians that in going forward, in building this new state, and these transformations and reforms that are happening, it will be useful that we really have some form of acknowledgement. And the discourse on acknowledgement for me becomes more important in the context of national reconciliation. Because national reconciliation is a political process. And it begins when national actors publicly acknowledge the legacies of the past and genuinely commit themselves to finding ways to build a new kind of politics. I think that's something I want to interrogate. The international constitution is not easy and it cannot be forced, and I think politicians have made that point. So when political actors come together and say, we recognize what has happened, and we want to commit ourselves to a new kind of governance, to a new kind of politics, the politics of inclusion and consultation. We will differ. We will vigorously contest all our views before Tunisian society, but never again shall we use underhand methods against each other, against our own position, or undermine the welfare of the average Tunisian. What it does, it complements the constitutional process, it complements the reform process, but it creates a new mindset for the average Tunisian. Maybe things might be better. Maybe things might change. And therefore, I can commit myself to this new process. So it creates a pensive environment. And I want to end with another experience from Sierra Leone. The woman who was a governor, she was a very successful businesswoman in Sierra Leone. Had a Mercedes Benz car in the 80s, very successful. Because of the conflict, both her legs were amputated. So she now moved around in a wheelchair. So when she came to testify before our commission, I asked her, what will it take for you to reconcile with those who did this? Yeah, that's what I last one.
Donc, je rappelle son égalitaire complètement accordée à chacun.
Pas
de conséquences. Merci. Aujourd'hui, on peut sauter au horizon, très très riche, qui met aussi l'accent sur les valeurs et les principes des Nations Unies en matière de justice transitionnelle. Sans m'attarder, donc je donne tout de suite la parole à Madame Dr. Moumara Pro, commissaire des droits de l'homme, et après interviendra M. Radis, qui connaît le centre de justice transitionnelle, qui j'espère respecteront lui à chacun. Merci.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be glad to you in the time that has been allocated to me is to offer some reflection on the approach of the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to the issue of transitional justice and to highlight some of the key principles that innovate bound the United Nations approach to transitional justice. And I will try to do that without repeating what has been said before me, which is quite a difficult task. So, for the UN, it is now widely accepted that transitional justice mechanisms help to ensure redress for victims of massive violations of human rights in certain exceptional circumstances. And in practical terms, transitional justice processes embrace four pillars: criminal justice, through seeking reparations, and institutional reform. And the UN has been advocating for something that we call a comprehensive approach to transitional justice. In a way, a combination of these four pillars, the prosecutions, through seeking reparations, and institutional reform. So there has been an acknowledgement that, for example, the fact that a country has embarked on a truth-seeking process it doesn't absolve it of its obligations in the criminal justice area. Clearly, it's a very complex process, and we have heard that from my colleague earlier this morning on how to combine these different processes in a way that will satisfy the needs of each country. I would like to now briefly address each of the components of the transitional justice that I just mentioned, and perhaps highlight some of the principles that I think would be relevant in the context of Tunisia. So, with regard to the prosecution initiative, you know that the state has the primary responsibility to investigate and prosecute gross violations of human rights. But it is important to remind ourselves that the credibility and the legitimacy of the prosecution initiatives require that they are conducted in accordance with the international standards of the fair trial, and that they are conducted in a non-discriminatory and objective manner. And it is regardless whoever the perpetrators are. The second area is the area of the truth-seeking, and you have heard a lot about the contribution of the truth-seeking commissions or commissions of inquiry and other fact-finding bodies to revealing or to realizing the right to the truth. I would also like to mention that the effective implementation of the right to the truth requires the preservation of, but also access to archives and other evidence concerning the violations of human rights in order to facilitate the knowledge of such violations. And such measures are indeed aimed at preserving the collective memory. The third area, or the third component of the transitional justice, is related to the right to victims to receive reparations. And there are some international instruments that particularly focus on this area, and there are principles and guidelines on the right to remedy and reparations, which elaborate different terms of the reparations. Restitution, that could include restitution of property, but also restitution of civil and political rights. Rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition, and of course, compensation. And in this context, it should be also highlighted that the symbolic reparations are significant, as they can provide recognition to victims, not only as victims, but also as citizens and right holders in general. And the reparations programs that manage to distribute a variety of benefits or combine the different forms of the reparations, material but also symbolic, and that are distributed to victims individually but also collectively, are more likely to cover a large proportion of the victims. And finally, with regard to the institutional reform, which is in a way the fourth component of the transitional justice, we all agree that the public institutions that help to perpetuate the repressive rule or conflict must be transformed into the institutions that protect human rights and foster a culture of respect for the rule of law. So while the police, the security, and the military officials who are responsible for the human rights violations should not continue to serve in these public institutions, it is important that any vetting process or arbitration process will comply with the due process requirements and again the principle of non-discrimination. So again, it's a fairly complicated area on how to ensure the due process requirements while embarking on the vetting process. Let me now turn to some of the guiding principles that govern the UN's work in this area. And the United Nations, as the guardian of the international standards, must clearly be guided itself by and conduct its transitional justice activities in compliance with the international law. And the rules enshrined there, and in a way, these are your pillars for your transitional justice work, include the duty to undertake effective investigation and prosecution of the serious crimes under international law. But the international law also recognizes the right of victims to reparations, the right to know the truth about the past violations, as well as guarantees of the non-recurrence, and the guarantees of the recurrence indeed could be exercised through appropriate institutional reform. So these international standards are normative boundaries for the UN engagement, and the UN, for example, would not embark on supporting the establishment of the International Tribunal if the International Tribunal provides for a death penalty. So that is one area which would be a red line for the UN. At the same time, the UN would not support any amnesties for the most serious crimes under international law and for the gross violation of human rights. The second principle, and I will just touch upon that briefly, but I think it's important to remind ourselves, is this principle of one size does not fit all. So when designing the transitional justice processes, each country's situation has to be taken into account, and you will not be